Good morning. How are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit. Welcome back to another video. And today we're going to run through the value hand section of the Postflop workbook, go through an entire hand with you. And this is going to be 3 pages, page 207, 208, and 209. And without further ado, let's jump right into it and show you how to do these problems. Alright, so starting with the prompt, we are playing a 5-10 cash game. You open raise to 25 from the cutoff. The big blind is the only caller. They check the flop and you c-bet for 40, and we see all that right here. We have king queen, $40 c-bet, flop of king 9 deuce with a flush draw, and the big blind checks to us. And if this is a little confusing, it makes it look like we have the button. It's not true. It's just to denote who has position. So if you're ever looking at these, you're like, why is the button there? That is why. So this is the range that we think the big blind has right this moment when they're checking, and let's get working. So number one, when the big blind has a flush draw and opts to check call the flop, how often will they make their flush on the turn? Well, let's start by throwing everything into Flopzilla first, make life a little bit easier. So king of diamonds, queen of hearts, flop is king of spades, 9 of hearts, deuce of hearts. Just grab the range right out of the answer key, page 207, copy that. Paste it in right here, hit enter, excellent. Okay, so that being said, we don't actually need Flopzilla for this question itself because this is straight probability, but it's always helpful just, we're going to need this at some point in the question for sure. So again, when they have a flush draw and they check call the flop, how often will they make their flush on the turn? Well, we can use the very simple calculator that we used for the runout section. And normally when we're on the flop, there are 47 unseen cards, right? There are 52 cards in the deck. We have 2 in our hand. We see 3 on the board. So 52 minus 5 gets us to 47 remaining cards. But in this situation, we're assuming that we know the big blind has 2 hearts in their hand, which means we actually only have 45 unknown cards in that scenario. And so if they have a flush draw, how many hearts are left in the deck? Well, there are 2 hearts, the 2 hearts on board, the 1 heart in our hand, 13 total hearts in the deck, minus those 5 that we see, or we think we see based upon the situation. And we have, 8 total cards left? Perfect. So 8 over 45 gets us to 18%. Easy peasy. Question number 2, how often would the big blind check raise if they would only check raise with nut flush draws and 2 pair or better? So in Flopzilla, let's just, again, we already set everything up. So let's plug in, 2 pair or better. So all of that. And then also nut flush draws. So what we can do is in flush draw, if we right click it, we can just select the nut flush draws, right? So those have the color selected with them. The others are in gray, which means they're not selected. And now we are good to go there. And we see we're talking about 5%. So that is how often they would check raise if that is going to be their exact check raising range. And number 3, if the big blind check calls your c-bet, is it possible to get stacks all in if they check call pot size bets on the turn and river? So if we quickly eyeball this, and let's just say that they call our $40 c-bet, we're talking about 80 plus that, so like 130 in the middle. If we pot the turn for another 130, yeah, no, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to get stacks inside. We can proof this out with a pot geometry calculator. So effective stacks right this moment. Oh, and by the way, the pot right here is before the $40 c-bet is taken into consideration, so make sure to keep that in mind. This is not including, this 55 pot size is not including the 40. It wouldn't make any sense anyway. And this bet, the pot size, the stack size that we have right this moment is after our bet. So we actually have 1390 to start this street after the 40 is already taken out. So in this exact situation, the effective stack is, of course, the big blind stack. They have the smaller of our 2 stacks. So 1185. And the pot on the flop is 55. And we need to bet 40, so 0.72, perfect. Okay, so that gets us where we need to be. And then we have a 100% pot on the turn, 100% pot on the river. So we see that on the river, there's still going to be like $600 left, give or take, after they call a potter on the river. So yeah, there's definitely still going to be money left. And no, it's not going to happen. So the thing is this is really helpful for saying, okay, like, let's just say you're on the value side of the spectrum. Let's just say that you had like I don't know, pocket nines here. Like, yeah, I definitely want to try to go for stacks against my opponent. It's helpful to say, hey, is it even possible to get stacks all in? And in this situation, even if we potted it, what does that look like? Can we get stacks inside? No, we still have stacks left at that point. So the only way to get stacks inside is with a raise somewhere along the line or an overbet somewhere along the line. And again, just good information to know. Not too common in a single raise pot in a cash game where we're talking about 100 big blind plus depth that it's difficult to get stacks inside, but this is helpful to kind of take the extra time, take the reps, and go through it. So let's double check the answer key, make sure we got everything right. So 18% for number 1, 5% for number 2, and no for number 3. Perfect, got all that correct. Now let's move on to the next page and continue going through. All right, so starting with the prompt up above, they call your flop c-bet and check you again on the turn. You barrel 90 into a 135 pot on the turn, and here's the whole setup. Queen of spades on the turn. You can throw that right into Flopzilla. And just to make your life easier, I just said, okay, instead of trying to tell you, okay, set this filter, set that filter, set that filter, when we're going from street to street, which, by the way, would be incredibly meticulous, especially when it comes to like exact combo counting or weights, as there are in some of these examples. I just said, you know what, let's just copy the range right out of the answer key and make your life a lot easier. So page 208, just going to copy that range and throw that in. Perfect. We can keep everything else the same, right? We keep the flop and now turn the same. Obviously, our starting cards, we're just looking at this range right this moment, and this is the range that we assume that the big blind check called the flop with. So if you're overlooking here and like, hey, why isn't this hand included anymore? It was probably raised somewhere along the way or folded somewhere along the way on an earlier street. So keep that in mind if you're like, where the heck are these ranges coming from? And also, why are you just giving me straight ranges on the next street? This saves a lot of time. And also, it's just one of the things like, say I try to give you the exact kind of filters to set and you miss like 1 or 2 combos, it can massively change your answers, especially when we're getting into later streets. So I try to avoid that and make life a little simpler. Okay, so everything is set up in here. Question number 1, how often did the big blind improve to a made straight on this turn card? So made straight is 10.13, so 10% of the time. All right, question number 2, assuming the big blind check calls the turn with pair plus gut shot hands like King 10, Queen Jack, and 10-9, how often will they improve to a made straight on the river? So all of those hands are going to have gut shots, and they're all going to have 4 outs, right? Because we're not blocking any of those outs. Perfect. All right, so if that's the case, pretty simple. We can pull out that runouts calculator. That's not the right tool. Perfect, and we know that we're on the turn. We see 46 cards, so there are 46 unseen cards right this moment, and they just have a raw 4 possible cards to improve to that gut shot. We don't know exactly which one is faded versus not faded, so we're going to take all 4, and that gets us to 9%. That's how often those pair plus gut shot hands are going to improve to a made straight on the river. And the last question for this page, if the big blind would check raise here with 2 pair or better, what is the strongest hand in their check call range on the turn? So if we're in here and we assume that they're going to check raise with, what do we say, 2 pair plus? So we're going to select 2 pair plus, and if that's the case, those are all in red. The strongest hand remaining would be what? No overpairs to select from. Top pair, yes, we have that, and it looks like King Jack is the strongest of those, and then King 10 after that, and then King 8, and so on. So it looks like King Jack is going to be the strongest hand that would be in their check call range, based upon the assumption that they're going to check raise with 2 pair plus. And checking the answer key real quick just to make sure we're on the right track. So 10% of the time, 9% in King Jack. Perfect. Now let's move it on to page 209 and go through the river part of this example. All right, so beginning at the top with the prompt, they call your turn bet, and again, checked you on the river. You bet 165 into a 315 pot. Here's the setup, 3 of hearts on the river. Let's just pop that in, and let's see. All right, so again, we're just going to copy that range right out of the answer key. We're on page 209, so copy that one. Perfect. Clear that out. Paste that in. Excellent. All right. So question 1, how many combos of made flushes does the big blind have on this river? So combos is what we're looking for. So hit the tab key in Flopzilla to flip from percentage to combos. And we see there are 22 flush combinations available. Excellent. Number 2, what is the EV of checking behind in this situation? So we can use the river bet versus check tool for this one and plug in a couple of basic numbers. So the pot size right this moment is 315. Excellent. And if we go back to Flopzilla, hit the tab key, get out of there. Okay, so against their entire range, we know we're looking at their entire range right this moment because this is in red and everything's in red, which means we're just looking at all of the hands right this moment. And by the way, if you ever get confused in here and you're like, why are my answers adding up? Make sure you don't have any filters that are kind of like set in stone. Again, when you have the green, it's only going to carry through what you've filtered. Otherwise, if it's in red, it's looking at everything. So right this moment, this is looking at the entire range that the big blind would check with right this moment. So we're looking for our equity against that range. And we see right here, we have 67.6, so round that up to 68% equity. So check and win percentage is 68. Check and lose is obviously going to be the opposite of that, so 100 minus 68 or 32%. And our EV in that scenario would be 214. Excellent. And now let's do number 3 together, and this is going to be a little bit more complex. You'll notice that a lot of the river ones will be a little bit more complex. You usually are going to require some tools to be used. A lot of tools have already been used for some of the earlier ones too, so don't be shocked if you have to use a lot of tools in general. And for what it's worth, this is the kind of exploration I like to do with my own hands. I like to take my time with them. I like to look at things from a couple of different lenses. I like to ask myself these questions about, maximum number of combos of really nuttish combinations, especially when we have something like, top 2 pair. If I'm ever thinking about folding, I really have to think about what is my opponent's range if they do decide to check raise in this situation, and do I ever beat that, or do I think they really only check raise with 20 something combos and they're pretty much all going to be made flushes, that kind of thing. And this can really help me analyze things more technically in real time, which can be, of course, extremely helpful. All right, and number 3 is, what is the EV of betting 165 here if the big blind would only call with top paired straights, fold every weaker hand, and you would bet fold against any raise? And obviously, if we're thinking about bet folding, we're assuming that they're really only going to be check raising with things like exactly made flushes. When they continue by calling, we think that's going to be top pair and then some of those made straights, and that they're going to fold all the weaker things. So if we think about the way that we would set this problem up, there are essentially 3 different outcomes, right? 3 different branches. There's the we bet, they fold, we win that one. There's the bet, they continue, we win some of the time. There's the bet, they continue, and we lose some of the time. So classic spot to use the complex EV formula, just use the spreadsheet that we've created. And we need F and C first. So essentially, how often is our opponent folding when we bet, and how often are they continuing? So in this situation, we assume they're going to continue with top pair or better, right? Because they're going to call with top pair, they're going to call with straights, they're going to raise with flushes, and they're folding all the weaker hands, which in this case is middle pair and the weaker pair hands. So right this moment, we see that they are continuing 54% of the time, and thus folding that other 46. So if we go in to there, the fold is going to be, 46%. They're continuing 54, and the current pot right this moment is 315. Excellent. And then let's plug in a couple of other numbers. So when we bet and lose, and that's whether they call or they raise, because again, we're assuming we're just going to bet fold against those flush check raises. So when we actually lose, we're losing our bet, which right this moment is 165. And just for the record, when you're doing these exercises, keep an eye here, because sometimes we test different bet sizes. So sometimes it's the exact one from the question. Other times it's a slightly bigger one, slightly smaller one. So pay attention to that just in case your answers are different for any reason. So 165 on the loss side. When we bet, they continue and we win. We are winning the 315 pot plus their 165 call. Our bet, we don't win that, so we only add in what they're calling and the pot itself. So equals 315 plus 165. Excellent. And now we just need the win percentage and the loss percentage. So in this situation, we can go to Flopzilla and start punking around. So what I think is most helpful to look at here is when they do continue, let's look at the continuance stuff only. how are we doing against that? Because if we think about our equity against this stuff, right, when our opponent has exactly top pair, how are we doing? Well, 100% equity. That's all well and good. We win that all the time. When our opponent continues with the straights, obviously we are not doing great on that. When we lock it in, we have 0% equity. So we're not winning when they continue with that. Obviously, we're not winning when they continue by check raising the flushes because we're just going to bet fold. We lose that 165. So what I like to do here is say, okay, when they continue with top pair, we're going to mark that in blue, we win. And when they go with the check call with the straights, we lose. And then when they check raise, obviously we lose that as well. And then over here, I'm going to mark this in, and then I'm going to show display grouped hands only, which it happens actually when you do this, but say we didn't do this, by the way, and you were here, you could also do just display grouped hands if you didn't want to mark it in yet. This is another way of doing that. And in this situation, what are we looking at? So of their continuance range, 39.47% of the time, we are going to win that because we have 100% equity there. And then the rest of the time, we are going to be losing it. So let's just plug that in right here. So our win percentage, our W percentage, is 39. Perfect. Excellent. And the percentage L obviously auto-calculates. It's 100% minus that 39, and you're good to go. Now, if there were extra complexities here, for instance, say that some percentage of the time when your opponent check calls, your equity is not 100%. Well, you have to do some other more advanced calculating in the spot. But for this one, because it's 100% when they continue with top pair, 0% equity when they continue with the straights, then this is very, very flat and easy. Now, when we go check the answer key, let's just plug the answer in right this moment. So 192 there, when we check the answer key for page 209, 22 good, 214 good, 192, oops, off by $1. So first and foremost, being off by $1 or $2 here is really not the end of the world in the slightest. And this is one of those situations that comes up where there is some slight rounding going on. So there are two major rounds that happened here. First and foremost is this one, right? So 39.47, that's pretty darn close to, almost rounding up to 40, which if we were actually to go in here and say 39.47, you actually notice that it calculates correctly. So that 193 is right there. But in this workbook, a lot of times we just kind of round down and keep things simple. So every now and then you might find yourself off by $1 or $2, but it just is what it is. And then the other rounding part in this spot is over on the continuance on the flop itself, right? So remember that they are folding 46.48. Again, that's getting close to 46.5, which might round to 47. So again, like sometimes when you're rounding like dead smack in the middle or very, very close to it, you're going to be rounding off by like $1 or $2. You could always do these by hand to hard proof them, just in case you're not sure. The answer key is based upon the hard proof, so there are slight modifications and stuff in some of these. So if you're ever looking, you're like, why am I off by $1 or $2? Don't get overly frustrated. Chances are you're definitely in the ballpark. Of course, if you're confused at all, you need any clarification, don't hesitate to ask. But if you're off by $1 or $2, that's oftentimes why. Just slight rounding things. But it happens. So again, hopefully this helps you kind of set up the process. This is at the end of the workbook for a reason, right? You're building upon a lot of the skills and analytical things that we did earlier in the workbook. This is just kind of giving you extra reps with those through the lens of value hands. And hopefully this kind of helps you look at extra ways that you can start exploring your own hands. Again, this is a large chunk of the way that I use my off-table time is taking hand histories I've played, analyzing them the way they played out, but then also making slight tweaks and slight adjustments and asking myself, okay, what if they continued slightly wider, slightly tighter? How often is that happening? Yes or no? Often could I get away with extra bluffs in this situation, etc., etc. So it gives you like extra things to go and chew on. But again, hopefully this kind of helps you understand what you're doing in this section. There are lots of different kinds of questions, so take your time with them. If you ever get confused, just don't hesitate to ask me. I'd be happy to help as best I can. And of course, hopefully you enjoyed. If you need anything at all, let me know. Otherwise, good luck out there and happy grinding.